So I'd like to open the floor, and please join me, first of all, in thanking all of our speakers. Terrific. I'd like to now open the floor to the audience for Q&A. We have 15 minutes, which is wonderful. I'd like audience members to please let us know to whom your question is directed, if it's directed to one speaker, two, or the entire panel. And also, I'd like to ask, please, that you kindly keep your questions focused so that we have time to take as many questions as possible, and also give our panelists adequate time to respond. Okay, so any questions from the audience there? Okay, I'll take the liberty to ask the first question, and that is, I just made a note here. This is a question for all of our speakers. I would really be interested to hear your thoughts about the tension in much of what we hear about climate change and the response that it's going to necessitate. We hear a lot of conversation around adaptations required, the resiliency that's going to be required of communities as they adapt to climate change. And I'd like to hear from your various perspectives what you think about the tensions between the role of adaptation and also the role, maybe tensions or the relationship between the role of adaptation and the role of advocacy as we deal with this issue. Often I'm struck by who is asked to adapt to change and the relationship or tension between this and who has the power to speak or to make change about these issues. So my question is about the balance of adapting versus advocating for change or even activism on these issues.
Maybe I'll go first. Adaptation is not a choice. Adaptation is something you either do or you don't. Advocacy is one of the ways in which you can try to increase your chances that either your or the people you care about are able to adapt effectively. And it's a skill set. And so the better you can advocate, the more likely you'll be able to adapt. The better you advocate, the more likely you'll be able to mitigate as well. So I think that as the pressures increase and the incentives increase, the likelihood that you'll see more and more groups, more individuals, more communities advocating for their own well-being is going to increase. A lot of what we learn about in terms of advocacy skills comes from the business sector because they've always had a very tangible stimulus for advocating. And it's only more recently that we've been given the population at large as many verbal tools and as many media tools to be able to advocate as effectively as business people have been doing for decades.
Okay, well, that's a very interesting question, a little bit outside my comfort zone, but one of the things I notice about advocacy and adaptation is that often the advocates and those who need to adapt are not seen to be the same people. And I think this is a very big problem because it's very easy to tell other people what they should do and much harder maybe to make the changes yourself. On the other hand, I'm also aware that some people think that simply by making a personal adaptation themselves, saw this with recycling, you see it with energy conservation, things that we can do in our own lives, that somehow that's enough. That I've done my bit and that's all I have to worry about. And so they don't really become advocates in a social or larger sense for the changes that, unless they're made community-wide, society-wide, really won't fix the problem. And that's where I sort of see the tension, the sort of disconnect between what we can do as individuals, whether that's enough, and what role we should be playing as advocates to bring about change in the larger society. And somehow, you have to do both. You can't be a legitimate advocate for other people to change if you don't make the changes yourself.
I guess I'll just add one quick idea. So in the Arctic and in all three of the IHAC regions, Indigenous people are incredibly adaptive people. They're often portrayed as these like victims of climate change, but they're really not. They're really adaptive, and they've been really at the forefront of climate change adaptation. And I think that they are able to play a really effective advocacy role. I mean, Inuit, for instance, were at the forefront on the global ban on DDT, for instance, because it was impacting mothers' breast milk in the Arctic, for instance. But I think that the challenge or the tension for them is that people, hear that we've already met this 2-degree increase in annual temperature threshold in the Arctic. In some regions in the Arctic, annual warming is above 4 degrees Celsius. But people don't see it as relevant to their lives because the Arctic is far away. But what people don't realize is that the same ways that climate change is impacting Inuit health are going to be the same ways that they're impacting all of our health.
I'd like to just say that, the media, I think as journalists, we are not operating in the realm of advocacy per se. We're really here to tell stories. But I really want to, emphasize and encourage all of you to use the media to tell your stories, because I think it empowers advocacy.
Thank you so much. Okay, we have a question over in the back there, if we could get a microphone there.
Thank you. I'd like to commend all the speakers for a wonderful panel discussion, and there's shock doctrine going through all of your presentations, and so it was really good to see this as a segue out from what we heard last night. My question is for Peter, though, and I know Yogi Berra wasn't an economist, but he did say it was always tough to make predictions, especially about the future. And economists seem to be enthralled with this notion of trying to model the future. So if we're headed towards a steady state economy, there needs to be a modeling and a description of what that new economic model actually is. And it'd be really good to hear your thoughts about where should we be moving to in terms of that economic model, and how is it structured in a way that meets all those sustainability issues and so on. Thank you.
That's quite an agenda, and it's the sort of thing I'm going to be talking about in the workshop later on. But just to sort of say a few comments about that. I've emphasized in my remarks this morning that I believe we're putting too great a burden on the biosphere because of the material relationships between the economy and the biosphere. So when we talk about a steady state economy, it's got to be one where we see, in fact, a reduction in the flow through. We use the word throughput of materials and energy to keep the economy going. So a steady state is a tricky concept because it leaves open what is it you're going to hold steady. Those of us who work on this topic think that we can conceive of an economy in which the annual production of goods and services, particularly in a rich country like Canada, can be stabilized at a respectable level with an accompanying decline in throughput, but also in a way, if we make some other changes, where in fact we become more prosperous as a society. If we, for example, if we continue to become more productive, that we're able to produce more and more things with less and less labor, then instead of producing more things, we work less. We have a reduction in work hours. And there was a trend in that, but it's stalled now for the time being. So that would be one dimension of a steady state economy, one in which we would have more personal time, more time to spend with friends and family. I think there has to be changes in the kind of enterprises that we have. When we have large corporations that are so fixed on very short-term profits, that's inconsistent with the kind of economic system that I'm sort of trying to sketch out here. So there's some real interest in resurrecting the older interest in cooperatives, which aren't driven by the same motivations. One of the big problems, or one of the big changes that I see is in what we invest. Whenever an economy produces goods and services, some of those are consumed and some are put aside in real investment. We build buildings and furniture and equipment and so on. in order to move to a steady state economy which isn't doing so much damage to the biosphere, we've got to change the pattern of investment dramatically. And part of that change requires investing in things that don't yield a profit. So, for example, when you create a new national park, for example, if that was a measure you thought was useful for protecting biodiversity, that's not done because it yields a financial return. So it's not something that the private sector gravitates towards. So the question is, how do you shift the pattern of investment away from things which provide a lot of short-term return into things which don't necessarily provide any financial return, but in fact make us all better off? And that takes you into, well, does that mean you've got to change the financial system and the way that functions? So you see the sort of web, which is really what you're asking me. What does that look like? As I say, I can't go into any detail on any of these topics right now, but there's a lot of work that's being done and a lot's been written and there's got lots of material out there, but there's also more to be done. But I hope I've given you some flavor of where I think we need to go.
And the workshop this afternoon will expand on the idea of steady state economies as well. So we invite you all to join that. We have a question here in the middle of the room.
Thank you for a fabulous panel. I thoroughly enjoyed all of your talks, and particularly Dr. Zigbee. I was thinking about, we often refer to fossil fuels as an addiction. And as somebody who does work in addiction, I also recognize the parallels that when somebody comes into eMERGE with an addiction, our well-meaning physicians and healthcare professionals want them to go straight into action because we can see what's wrong with what they're doing. And I think that model translates into this. There's pre-contemplation, contemplation, and planning. And when I'm working with people with addiction, the most important part that we miss is planning. Advocacy often is about going from pre-contemplation to action. It never works with any other addiction, and I don't see it working in this. So how do we get people to step back, do the motivational interviewing type of technique with the planet to help them go from pre-contemplation to action? So in a way, I'm asking, how do we do the planning? And I'm also seeing this as a huge role for physicians. I think we're perfectly positioned to understand addiction and to understand the steps that it takes to get to action and just how we can kind of work together to create that, the ability for planning to create the change, not just the shocking into action that hasn't worked in any other addiction.
Fantastic analogy, and I'm sure there's input from all members on that. How would I say that? To take your analogy a little bit further of the addiction, you can sort of see the patient as being not just you can begin at the individual, but you can also begin at the community, you can begin at the nation, you can begin at the planet. And I think taking it from the point of view of the motivational interviewing style, it's interviewing the particular body who you're interested in trying to influence and finding out what makes them tick. And so if it's your community that you want to try to wean off fossil fuels, you have to find out what's keeping them on it and find out what are their benefits for it and try to create a plan together with a series of steps of how they're going to get a little closer to getting off of that addiction. Often going cold turkey can be a solution for extreme situations, but most often when people can visualize the steps together, feel as if they have something to gain from it, can visualize the gain in taking those steps, they're much more likely to do so. And the last part is putting in place the environment by which people are all going to win. So that usually entails making sure that communities have some say in the way that transition is going to be and have some benefit, either financially, quality of life-wise, or otherwise, with respect to what's going to happen in that transition.
Would any of the other panelists like to respond? Yep.
I think that was just so beautifully put, and the question is also, so apt. And I think that what's encouraging is that I think planning is happening. It's been underway. The unfortunate part is that we weren't planning in the early part of the 1900s that we got into this predicament. But there's so much, underway. And I think, that question is just, can it happen fast enough? And can we get there in time? But thank you for that analysis. It gives me a lot to think about in reporting on it.
Okay, and we have a question in the front here.
It's a comment. I think the Inuits are a canary in the mine shaft, and as the ice melts, greenhouse gases are increasing over the entire planet, and we're all going to suffer as a result of that. The indigenous people, all peoples. And I think the idea of shifting to a non-profit economy where GDP isn't the addiction of everybody in business and economists, keep measuring its growth, the growth has to stop. If it's estimated that if the entire planet lived like North Americans, we would have to have 6 planets or more to live. That's just unjust. So we have to really change the model, and the model has to be changed very quickly. And how do we change our addiction to consumerism and the need to have more and more, the best cars, the best everything, and more, because our media tells us it's the way to go. I pick up a newspaper, the only advertisements are for cars, and you know what they consume. The only advertising people can afford are for cars, because the media charges a lot. Certain media, But my point is, the first step in addiction modification is recognizing that we have a problem. Open to the panel.
Well, of course, I very much share your views. The problem with having sort of been working on these issues for a long time is you realize how difficult it is to make change. I often say now, we can't change fast now because it's too late to change fast. Changing fast should have happened. Now, go back to the Limits to Growth book when it was published in '72. It laid out pretty much the same story that we're telling ourselves now, is that we're decades on. I don't have an easy answer, any kind of answer to how you actually bring about change. The role I try to play is to at least try to identify a number of feasible alternatives, because one of the problems that I'm always confronted with is the view that there is really no alternative. This is how humans sort of ended up with this kind of economic system and political system. This is as good as it's ever going to get, and somehow we've got to make it work. Now, if you take the view that it can't, in fact, be made to work without some substantial changes to it, you have an uphill battle trying to persuade lots of people. So one of the books I wrote, I subtitled Slower by Design, Not Disaster, because I think that's the choice. We will change. It'll either be because we've been thoughtful about it and we've looked at the alternatives and we've had some democracy at work and we've dealt with the power structures that exist and we've worked our way through to a better future, or the crises will just come faster and faster and we will be forced to change. So it's a really nice, well, I think there are choices. But I'm not particularly optimistic that we have the social and institutional structures to make the sorts of change that are necessary.
Yeah, and I think that people are, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, please.
I think that people are starting to, embrace climate change as a challenge and that it's real and that it's happening. But I think that for a lot of Canadians, I'm not completely convinced that they recognize it as a problem. I'm from rural Ontario. And when I go home to visit my family, most of my family members and most of the community members, they don't believe that climate change is a real issue, which is leads to really interesting dinner time conversations. But anyways, when you go to the Arctic, you go there and you see the changes. They're visible, you can't ignore them, like they're obvious. And so you see that the climate is changing and the impacts that it has on livelihoods and on health. It's a little less obvious, I think, for some of us who are not so intertwined with the environment in the way that we used to be. But I think that there's small examples that you can pull at to bring the issue to the forefront, to make people see that it is an issue. So, for instance, my grandfather recently said that there might be something to this climate change thing because he noticed that he used to be a farmer and that the almanac series of the planting, the temperature zones, is changing and it's moving northward. So people are starting to see the changes and they're starting to link that to climate change. So your comment on, like recognizing that we have a problem in the first place, I think that we're gaining a lot of momentum, but we're not quite there yet still. And that's an anecdotal story.
Can I just add one more comment? Look, we're not just talking about climate change. If climate change was our only problem, I'd be a lot more upbeat. That chart I put up showing a whole range of ecosystem aspects of the ecosystem which are in a bad way. It's not just climate. Loss of biodiversity is a much more difficult problem to solve, and so that's why the implications for what we have to do in our economy and our society are much more far-reaching than simply changing our source of energy, as if that wasn't hard enough. I just think, climate change has almost taken over this discussion of humanity's interaction with the biosphere. There's some recent work, I'll mention it later in this fabled workshop that I'm going to be holding, that some of you might come to. The planetary boundaries literature is quite interesting, where they've identified now a set of 9 issues of global environmental significance, all of which are getting worse, and you can trace that back to the ever-expanding economies of the world.
There's a wonderful book. I mean, there's many wonderful books that have looked exactly at that type of argument, and I actually give me the most hope in this whole element was that as rapidly as climate change seems to be a catalyst for multiple different degenerative properties or processes throughout the globe, many of the solutions which are being posited actually have co-benefits across multiple different sectors as well. And I think that one of the issues in advocacy that I promote is the whole concept of green medicine. And green medicine is not looking at any one solution for its single biggest impact in any one particular determinant of health, or if you want to think of it a biosystem, but what type of changes are you going to see positive ramifications across multiple, if not all, different challenges facing the biosphere. And those are the choices that have to be made. So it has a lot more to do with picking those multi-impact type of changes, if you can be so lucky as to see some of those, and how to accelerate the implication of those.
And Linda, did you have something to add? No? Okay. Well, thank you all for a wonderful plenary panel, to the audience for your terrific questions, and to all of our panelists for your very provocative and very thoughtful responses. So please join me now in thanking everyone.